This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On July the 11th, the RCMI's Defence and Security Studies Committee held a made-for-podcast panel discussion on Canada's recently announced Foreign Policy Statement and Defence Policy Review.
First of all, it's a beautiful day in July, so thank you very much for taking time out of your day to come to this event. This is the first time we've tried something of this nature. If you think it's an interesting and useful approach, we'll do it again, perhaps at a different time of year when we're more likely to have a larger audience. But the fact that you're here is a great thing. So welcome to everybody. And of course, I need to recognize our president, Michael Hoare, who's right here, because if I don't, I'll get fired. So that's the first thing I need to do. And the other thing I'd like to do is thank our panelists, because virtually, with the exception of Fraser Holman, who had a little bit of a medical issue, he's not able to be here tonight. Otherwise, the entire crew of the RCMI Defense and Security Studies Program Committee, which is a real mouthful, are here. And what I'd like to do is ask each one of them to introduce themselves before we carry on with the rest of the evening. So, if I may be so bold.
I'm Reid Morden. I'm former Director of CSIS and a former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Good evening. I'm Keith Lawrence. I'm a retired colonel from the Canadian Forces, and I'm presently in the transportation and logistics industry.
And I'm John Selkirk, Lieutenant Colonel retired, Honorary Colonel past, and currently Executive Director of Reserves 2000, a group that advocates on behalf of primarily the Army Reserve.
And I'm Julie Lindhout. I'm the immediate past president of the NATO Association of Canada, and currently also working in consulting on international issues connected with NATO and economy.
John Thompson, a long time ago a reservist, within 4 years with the Canadian Institute of Strategic Studies and 22 years with the Mackenzie Institute, and currently blogging furiously and trying to make a go of it.
And my name is Bob Kennedy, retired from the Army a couple of years ago after 26 years, completing the term in the propaganda department, having spent 5 years in the parliamentary press gallery many years ago.
I'm Eric Morse with our vast studio audience, and I have an ancient degree in Soviet and East European studies, spent 15 years in the department, as it then was, of external affairs, and now work with this institute.
Okay, so thank you. I think you've got a good picture of the range of experience and expertise that our panel has. So, as Eric mentioned, first of all, this is the first time we've done this. It's a made-for-video event. As you know, the RCMI maintains a website, and virtually all of our speakers' events and special events are posted to the website, and this will be exactly that case, and so that's going to be great. Why are we doing this? Well, first of all, as you know, the Defense Policy Review is pretty recent. Yes?
Dan,
a question. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Dan. So I'm the director of the Defense and Security Studies Program Committee. I'm a longtime member of the RCMI, and I retired from the Canadian Armed Forces a year ago, June, which is unbelievable because it seems like yesterday. And I continue to teach at the Canadian Forces College, which is where I'm going tomorrow morning. But more importantly, and in respect of what we're doing here, I joined as the director of that program last fall, and it's been a tremendous opportunity. So, among other things that we do in the program, other than run these very interesting monthly events, pretty well every month of the year except August. Is we're the publisher of SITREP, the bi-monthly newsletter or professional journal, if you will, of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. So it's a great privilege, it's a great honor, and I'm enjoying myself immensely. And the first thing I said to myself when I got that position is, I need a whole bunch of people that are smarter than I am to make this thing work, and you have the evidence to my immediate left. So with that, thanks, Mike. I forgot to mention who the heck I was. Why am I sitting here? Clearly there's a lot of interest in the statement by the Minister of Global Affairs, Freeland, with respect to Canada's foreign policy that she announced in Parliament in June. And that was an interesting event. It was obviously very carefully scripted to precede the immediate release of the Defense Policy Review document, which happened virtually the next day, although interestingly that did not actually take place in Parliament. It took place more or less in a media context. And a number of institutes and organizations and individuals, analysts have made commentary on that, and we thought it was important to do the same thing here at the Royal Canadian Military Institute. But unlike some of the material that I've been reading, we're not really going to look at this document from what I would call a 30,000-foot perspective. I'll just mention two recent items that I read. One by the Conference of Defense Associations Institute, Colonel Charles Simpson, retired, did an analysis of the document from a sort of comparative perspective with respect to other nations, looking at what was included in the document and compared it to what other nations had published, and whether or not that our version of such a document included the same types of material and content that other nations had done. And what he found was that actually the document held up very well. For example, it set the stage in terms of general foreign policy issues, potential threats in the future, trying to tie how the Canadian Armed Forces would respond to those potential threats in terms of capabilities and so on. So that's an interesting thing. It didn't really surprise me because one of my master's students last year at the Canadian Forces College wrote a paper on the subject of Canadian defense policy statements going back, I think, over 6 or 7 iterations, back to the 1970s, looking at those kinds of policy documents and trying to determine what was the same, what was different, what would necessarily be included, in terms of Canadian foreign policy objectives, in terms of the core missions of the Canadian Armed Forces, which, of course, as we well know, have not substantively changed and did not substantively change in this most recent document. So the fact that the document is consistent with both previous Canadian iterations as well as comparatively to other nations is not really surprising. So that was an interesting read, and the other one was a piece that was written by Joel Sokolsky, who's a professor at the Royal Military College, and he was interested in looking primarily at the financial aspects of what the document was trying to talk about. And of course he made the point that any of these sorts of documents really are speaking to the future. These are not really looking backwards, they're looking forwards. And to the extent that one cannot predict the future, then perhaps many of the assumptions under which such a document is written are going to be subject to skepticism, or just simply may well turn out to be unrealistic. So he was focused on what he called the asterisk, and the asterisk was related to a comment that was made in the document with respect to future funding being subject to operational considerations. In other words, do we really understand what operations Canada might be asked to be involved with or might choose to be involved with going forward, and how does that actually affect the proposed budgets? Where would that money come from, and how might that money affect what the government proposes to invest over the next 20 years or so. So we're not going to look at that document tonight from that sort of 30,000-foot perspective. What we did instead was we tried to narrow down into some of the details, and we selected 6 specific areas that we wanted just to focus in on, and there are 6 questions, and I asked my committee members to each have a look at one of those questions, and we don't have a tremendous amount of time, so we're not going to be able to go into huge amount of detail with respect to each of those points. But having said that, we'll get an opportunity at the end of their commentary and our back and forth for you to ask your questions and indeed to discuss any aspect of the review that you're interested in. So that's sort of how we're going to approach it. I'm going to ask the question and ask our committee member, our panelist, as it were, to make a comment, and then open it up to the rest. Try to get through this particular process in about 45 minutes. We'll see how we do. We may not get to all of the questions, so I apologize in advance if we don't get that far to those who are sitting on the far left of the line here. But we'll do our best. And then once that's finished, we'll, as Eric said, we'll take a short break, reposition the cameras, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the floor so we can all have our comments and questions. So that's where we're going. Does anybody have any questions for me or any comments that you'd like to make at this point, or shall we just proceed on? Okay, let's do that. So the first question had to do with, and I just want to comment on the fact that there was obviously a great effort made to, depending on how you want to look at it, delay the release of the Defense Policy Review long enough in order for the Minister of Global Affairs to be able to make a speech in the House of Commons with respect to Canada's foreign policy. Arguably, the Defense Policy Review had been written and in fact printed well in advance of that speech. And so the fact that there was an attempt made to try and link the two together was, in my own personal view, somewhat contrived. Logically, one's defense concept, one's defense policy would, at least in theory, normally flow from a broader perspective of one's foreign affairs policy. And so I think at least they recognized that fact, the government recognized that fact and said, well, let's ensure that we talk about our foreign affairs policy before we talk about our defense policy. So one was definitely linked to the next. So what I found interesting was this, and I'm posing this question initially to our esteemed colleague, Reid Morden, but let me just read a section, if I might, from the minister's speech. And this is what it said. She says, as I've argued, Canada believes strongly that this stable, predictable international order has been deeply in our national interest, and we believe it has helped foster peace and prosperity for our southern neighbors too. Yet it would be naive or hypocritical to claim before this House that all Americans today agree. Indeed, many of the voters in last year's presidential election cast their ballots, animated in part by a desire to shrug off the burden of world leadership. To say this is not controversial, it's simply a fact. Canada is grateful and will always be grateful to our neighbor for the outsized role it has played in the world. And we will seek and will continue to seek to persuade our friends that their continued international leadership is very much in their national interest, as well as that of the rest of the free world. Yet we must also recognize that this is ultimately not our decision to make. It is a choice Americans must make for themselves. The fact that our friend and ally has come to question the very worth of its mantle of global leadership puts into sharper focus the need for the rest of us to set our own clear and sovereign course. For Canada, that course must be the renewal, indeed the strengthening of the post-war multilateral order. So the question that statement posed in my mind was this: if we accept the premise that the U.S. is currently questioning its mantle of global leadership, to what extent and in what ways Is Canada capable of charting a sovereign course that is significantly at odds with U.S. policies? And is this, in fact, wise? Reid, what's your thinking on that?
Well, there's a whole course in
Yes,
that question
you
alone.
realize that.
So we're really only going to skip along the peaks here today. As an old practitioner in the foreign affairs biz, I have to say any time that a minister gets up in the House and actually makes a statement about foreign policy is to be applauded, and I applaud it vigorously. Our parliamentary history is replete with occasions which have been marked for a period of foreign policy discussion and have inevitably been hijacked by the domestic concerns of one member or another, with a view to the next election rather than the broader issue of where we're going in terms of our foreign policy. I think as well that whether the Defense Policy Review was already in the can when Mrs. Freeland made the speech. Yeah, maybe, and I'll kind of come back to that in a second, but basically I think anytime when a government is having somebody make a statement in the House that actually cross-references what's going on in some other part of the government, this also is to be applauded, because governments exist more in silos than they do in cooperation. So the fact that they are, however contrived you might say it is, at least they have made an effort to say these things are connected and we want to talk about them. And you know, that's more than fair. Mrs. Freeland's speech, of course, is not the result of a foreign policy review, and there has not been really a formal one since the new government took office a year and a half ago, unlike the Defense Policy Review, which is a very formal kind of thing. But I would just make the editorial comment that essentially these kinds of reviews and these kinds of statements are good things because they do two things. One is that whether it's the Foreign Affairs gang, and you made allusion to this, Dan, or in the Defense Policy Review, they update everybody's knowledge as to what the existing or emergency threats or issues are and so on. And that updating is really a very important thing to get on the record, so I think that's really a good thing. The other, maybe even more important result of intensive foreign policy and defense policy reviews is that it demonstrates to a government, particularly a new government, how small the margin for change really is, given the network of relationships, treaty obligations and various things, and our own just visceral interests that come into play. And that's actually quite, that's really actually quite important, I think. Well, to go to the particular, I think the essence of the question really derives from that last paragraph of the passage from Mrs. Freeland's speech that you wrote, or that you spoke of, Dan, and it has to do with what are we going to do if the Americans are now questioning their role as the leader of well, a global leader. Let's leave it at that. Her response, of course, is that, and that's what is said in the speech, is that Canada must devote itself to the renewal and indeed the strengthening of the post-war multilateral order. Well, I'd like to take those two assumptions and just look at them. The first one is that the Americans questioning their global role, their global leadership role. Well, somehow this came as a surprise to some people somewhere, and maybe Mrs. Freeland, I don't know. She hasn't spent a lot of time in Canada, so perhaps she doesn't see the United States from the exterior lens that we have. But Americans have been have an extremely long history, which we all know about, through their late entry into 2 global conflicts, of isolationism, that they really don't necessarily want to be part of the community of nations. And that's not just the leadership, that extends well into a pretty broad segment of the American populace. Since the war, and since the U.S. really became a global leader, you know, and particularly in the last 20-odd years, presidents, particularly Democrats, I have to say, have questioned what role they were going to play in the world. With respect to the Balkans, for example, President Clinton was bound and determined that he had far more pressing problems at home, and he was quite happy to leave the Balkan issue to the Europeans, which they desperately wanted to have in their doghouse. And they, of course, in the end, they couldn't do it, and they had to call the Americans, and we get the Dayton Accords as a result. The same with President Obama, much more recently, who, you know, has struggled, some would say not very successfully, with exactly how far was the United States going to go in being a global policeman. After Afghanistan, he vowed that there would be no more American boots on the ground. He talked about a pivot to the Pacific to take a look particularly at the emerging Chinese resurgence. But all these things really didn't come to fruition in the course of his last term of office. That said, I think the evidence is clear that he was out there questioning these things. And I have to say that quite a long time ago, I see there's enough gray hairs in the room that there's some people who may remember this, but 70 years ago, just after the war, a guy by the name of Eric Goldman wrote in the New York Times, and I think it's as applicable today, and he said, you know, there is a deep-seated American belief, and I'm quoting specifically, that foreign policy was something that you had, like measles, and you got over it as quickly as possible. And I think that, you know, there's an awful lot of that that's alive and well in the United States today. That said, you know, we really have now had 7 or 8 months of Mr. Trump, far more, of course, if you go back into some of his statements during his campaign. And I think at this point we ought to be able to distinguish between some of the things that get said, perhaps ill-advisedly, but nevertheless get said, and what the actions are doing. And I'll just give one example, otherwise we can certainly be here all day. You know, he was at some point questioning whether he would stand by NATO's requirements that there be some mutual defense assistance to people who were under threat, except that last week, of course, he came out in support of the famous Article 5, which is the mutual defense article of the NATO Treaty. So I think we have to sort of somehow make a distinction between what gets said in the initial tweet and what eventually happens. This second assumption that Mrs. Freeland says, well, if the Americans are questioning what they're going to do, well, it's up to Canada to sort of double down on restoring and strengthening the post-war multilateral order. Okay. I think that this is an assumption which is seriously flawed. It's not that there isn't within that canvas a tremendous opportunity to change, improve, strengthen, use whatever words you want. The incredible number of greater or lesser important bodies, international bodies that we think make up the post-war multilateral order. I mean, in terms of importance, I mean, we start off with arrangements like NATO, the Bretton Woods institutions, and then we move, you know, along the line to to the United Nations and the United Nations system, never mind all the regional gangs that we happen to belong to. But if we're going to go down that route, I think we had better, far more than was indicated in this speech, have some idea out of what a really, really large number, and virtually every organization we belong to, every body we belong to, is cataloged in Mrs. Freeland's speech. And it takes up quite a number of paragraphs. We do not have, in any way, the kinds of resources to deal with all these challenges. So the government had better be ready to pick the one or two where they think they can actually make a difference. And then, you know, in other words, you just throw the rest, unfortunately, you just throw the rest down the stairwell. The second ground on which I think the assumption is seriously flawed is that our life, our Canada, doesn't exist simply because we support and are a beneficiary of and an active participant in the multilateral post-war order. We have lots of bilateral things that have to be attended to, and some of them are very important and require quite a lot of activity. They're in many ways much closer to many of our palpable interests. Trading relationships come to mind. Obviously, we have to deal with a changing set of challenges with respect to the United States under whether it's under NAFTA or some other arrangement. We are at just the beginnings of a new trading relationship with Europe, which will require very, I think, careful gardening to make sure that the weeds don't grow too quickly. And our trading relationships really spread throughout the world as well. We have been pursuing new trading relationships with places as diverse as Israel, the Republic of Korea, and of course we have begun exploratory, I stress that, discussions with the People's Republic of China. So, in sum, if the government is looking for a foreign policy course correction, it's going to be a very small alteration in direction. And probably to rebalance our activities in parts of the multilateral system that we really care about, and we should be very careful about spreading ourselves too thin, because therein lies people doing a lot of things and not doing them particularly well, simply because we don't have the resources in the background to do it. Thank you.
Well, that's an A+. Well done.
Can I go now?
Yes. Off to dinner. We're going to carry on to the second question. We're all over the map with these questions, but that's okay.
Dan?
Yes, please.
Dan, before you go on, could I just add
Yes, of course.
something to Reid's comment?
Yes.
Last month, I was at a NATO Parliamentary Association meeting in Tbilisi, Georgia, and the NATO speaker there was the Deputy Secretary General, Rose Gottemuller, who, in spite of her name, is American. And she reiterated, sort of stated some of the same things that you said. Don't pay too much attention to what he says. He's simply trying to get some people stirred up to do a little bit more, but look at what he does. He has not cut any troops anywhere. He has not cut the budget. In fact, the new budget, the new U.S. budget, is approximately same, has no reduction. And he basically does what needs to be done. But the fact is that the U.S. does spend considerably more, significantly more money on defense than any other country does. So it really is no wonder that sometimes people get a little tired of being the butt of all kinds of opprobrium, while at the same time pulling, spending all the money.
Thanks, Julie. So now we're going to come out of the, shall we say, broader foreign affairs, global affairs issue and drill down a little bit more in terms of some of the specific items that were contained within the Defense Policy Review. So the first one that caught my eye was a section that was written on Canadian Armed Forces recruitment, training, and retention. So in that particular section, the policy states the following. The operational success of the Canadian Armed Forces begins with a robust recruiting system that engages and attracts the best and brightest, communicates the unique opportunities and benefits of military service, and efficiently and effectively selects and enrolls new recruits. The current system is too slow to compete in Canada's highly competitive labor market and does not effectively communicate the exciting and fulfilling employment opportunities offered by military service. So the question that I formulated was this, that given that recruiting targets across all of the desired cohorts that the Canadian Armed Forces identifies, including women, Indigenous persons, and visible minorities, are consistently not met, how can the Canadian Armed Forces attract and recruit the next generation of soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women? Is military culture really capable of attracting what we call the millennial generation? And I've posed that question to someone who has a great deal of experience in this field, Colonel retired Keith Lawrence. Keith, your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Dan. A robust and capable military requires the infrastructure, institutions, and equipment to succeed. But I think the key pillar are our people and the great Canadians who do great work for us at home and abroad. And I think it's also safe to state that there remains a recruiting challenge and retention issue that consistently confounds the Canadian Forces and affects our abilities to meet our needs at home and at abroad. Now, I think with the Defense Review, think tanks, conversations in the community, I think there's a realization that perhaps the recruiting targets for both the regular and reserve forces are difficult to achieve. And part of that also is that the training is taking too long after recruiting. Now, I also believe that the Canadian Forces should reflect the communities that make up a vibrant and diverse country. And I think increasingly in Canada, we have to have a Canadian Forces that reflects the entire makeup of our country. Because really the harnessing of the backgrounds and experiences of all Canadians will bind the institution to the country and will give us access to new viewpoints and experiences and cultures, whether serving at home or abroad. So keeping that in mind, I wanted to focus on 5 key thrusts. And some of them are quite tactical and 2 are quite broad with a bit more of a long-term approach. And the first one, if anyone knows anything about the recruiting process in the Canadian Armed Forces, is simplify the process. Leverage the digital age and the technology that exists to attract, recruit, and retain the finest minds in Canadians. Sell the benefits of the career. Why is it important for you as an individual? Why is it important to the community, and why is it important to our country? And we also have to include in that diversity of training, cross-functional training, and diverse employment. The modern generation does not expect to work in the same industry in the same country, or sorry, same industry or the same company, day in, day out, year after year. In fact, the way companies are set up these days, whether it's through pension plans or through horizontal or vertical employment, it isn't the same as it was post-Second World War. So I think we also have to create an effective linkage between the recruitment process, which we simplify, and then the training that occurs as part of the employment. A second idea, and it seems a little counterintuitive, but staff the recruiting centers with individuals from the trades that are most distressed, the occupations that require the most immediate attention. These are the individuals who can talk to the needs, express their requirements, and sell it to new Canadians why this is important. Again, it is a bit of an ask, but these are the people who can attract and explain why these trades are important. I think the next point will probably tie in somewhat to Colonel Selkirk's point, but I think what we need to do to attract, recruit, and retain people is leverage the knowledge of reserve recruiters. Why? There are many large and diverse cities in this country, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, etc. And there are vibrant reserve units and communities in these major urban centers that are actually having fairly good success attracting a diverse background of Canadians. And in some respects, there's a smaller gender gap between reserve units and the regular force. I think by the same token, we have to make the membrane between regular force and reserve service easier to move from one to the other, so that we can take reservists, great Canadians, and move them where the need is greater, and not just for operational missions. Speaking about Aboriginal recruits, which is one of the platforms within the review, I think we can leverage existing capabilities better. We have 5 Canadian Ranger Patrol groups across this country who day in, day out are working in Aboriginal communities. And I think along with leveraging reserve recruiters, we can also leverage these units with a great geographical footprint to attract those in the Aboriginal community who either wish to serve or are unaware of the opportunity to serve. I have 2 final points, and they're much more longer term. The first one is the concept of reestablishing defense infrastructure closer to major urban areas. If you remember in the late 80s, early 90s, certainly the peace dividend, we divested ourselves of a great deal of perhaps Second World War infrastructure that saw major closures in Calgary, Victoria, Winnipeg, London, portions of Montreal, Toronto, etc. I think that as we become increasingly an urban society, there's a requirement for Canadians to serve where Canadians live. And perhaps that isn't Shiloh or Wainwright or Petawawa. And so I think we can attract more people if we allow them to stay in greater touch with the greater Canadian community. And lastly, and this is a whole of government issue, as we try to attract new individuals into our recruiting system and serve an honorable career, is we have to educate Canadians, particularly new Canadians, not to distrust the tools of the state. Many Canadians' background includes coming from regions of the world where the military, police, and security services are highly distrusted, that do not reflect the minorities within those companies or countries, and in fact are not seen as being effective tools for the people. So I think we need to articulate a vision of the Canadian Forces that allows the individual to feel respected and part of a community. And I think in this respect, we would do well, along with the idea of leveraging reserve recruiters, is to look to the major police forces and emergency services that for many years have focused their recruiting campaigns on a diverse population. I think we would do well to understand the best practices and some of the pitfalls that they've gone through. Because, as I said, a great military is made up of great people. And we can have the infrastructure, we can have the institutions, we can have the equipment. Without those people, I don't think it matters. Dan?
Keith, that's great. Anybody on the panel want to comment on that at all?
Again, I'd like to
Julie?
just add one point to it. You mentioned that the reserves are already much more diverse than the regular forces. Another area where more attention should be paid for recruitment is the cadet program, because the cadets are in fact very diverse and very egalitarian. They're quite used to, as a matter of fact, they don't think of each other as being in any way different. At the same time, there's very little effort made to tie the cadet program into any kind of recruitment process. The kids simply age out, and then that's it, and nothing much more is done, whereas they could in fact be a good source of recruitment.
Can I make just a comment there? Speaking from the Navy League, which I was president of at one stage, the leagues themselves are rather against that close connection that we are developing a cannon fodder to feed in. In other words, the leagues are very chary about moving in that direction, simply because they don't want to be seen as a recruiting route into the armed forces. At least the Navy League is.
Yes, I accept that perspective exactly. There's a definite separation between the cadet program and the Canadian Armed Forces. So I think there's a group there that sort of has a sentiment towards perhaps in the future military service, but I think there's been a conscious decision to not link those two programs together.
I think that's been done more at the adult level, so to speak, than at the level of the kids themselves. They are much more eager to see themselves as part of the whole armed forces.
Right. Okay.
I think the sentiment's there, but when Canada joined the international community about issues revolving around child soldiers, it became a very sensitive topic, and I think that was one of the issues that created, in some respects, a separation. And I think it's an important one. I've certainly found in my service across the globe that the issue of child soldiers, or the perception of child soldiers, is an important one, and I think it's an important distinction to make between cadets and the regular force and the reserves.
No, good point. Good point. Right. Well, we've had. Sorry, I'm sorry, John. Go ahead. You need a mic there, John.
Sorry, just my 2 cents worth, but I'm half Irish Catholic in background, and on Saturday from my apartment at Bay and Gerard, I heard the sound of marching bands going up Bay Street, and took a look, and that was the Orange Lodge Parade. And given the history that went on, I just had to watch, but there was no King Billy on his white horse, nobody wearing bowler hats and orange sashes. But what also surprised me was at least half the marchers were Filipinos and Caribbean blacks. And that's just like the last place I ever expected to see them. But I think that leads to the point, actually, if we try and pitch a multicultural official policy, it's doomed to failure. Thing is, this is a society that has to go its own way. And leave the door open, take in whoever comes in, and I think we'll find the results will be the same thing without stretching ourselves off in awkward positions.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, Keith has mentioned the reserve force in his comments, so we're going to talk about the reserve force for a minute. And I picked out of the review from a section entitled A New Vision for the Reserve Force. And it states the following. It says, to ensure that the reserve force can continue to provide Canadian citizen soldiers with flexible opportunities to serve their country, the reserve force service model will be modernized, including alignment with job protection legislation. Military members must have the flexibility to transition between the full and part-time service, as well as the ability to pursue training and opportunities that suit their career in the Canadian Armed Forces, whether participating in deployed operations or serving on weekends and during the summer at the local reserve unit. Rigorous targeted training also contributes to enhanced interoperability between the regular and reserve force and ensures an integrated, deployable total force. So the question that came to my mind is, haven't we seen this before? Don't we already have elements of job protection legislation in place? Do you think that this vision is viable and takes into account the actual conditions of reserve service? And does the country require a new approach to the question of mobilization in order to honestly address the role of the reserve force? I can't think of anybody better to answer these questions than Colonel John Selkirk, President of Reserve 2000. John?
That's quite a lead-in, Dan. I'm not too sure I can do all that, but I certainly can't answer.
Give it a shot.
I'll give it a shot, and I'll try and do it quickly. There's too much there to do in just a few minutes. There's enormous questions been posed there. Have we seen it all before? Yep, we certainly have. And over the years, I would say that the Department of National Defense is primarily been the stumbling block here. It's not a question of a national vision. It's not been a question of citizen soldiers not wanting to do more, but the regulations that the department imposed. In many ways, there's been I would say for probably the last 50 years or so, a gradual imposition of more and more regulation along the lines of covering backsides of the senior folks at NDHQ. And that, of course, restricts what people can do. And if you take away the flexibility of the guy in all the 120 units, I'm not talking the Army Reserve only, but if you take away their flexibility, you've just robbed them of one of the greatest assets that they have. But centralization of policies has been the issue that has really almost emasculated the Army Reserve at this point. And I won't go into all the shortages that exist within the Army Reserve, but suffice to say there's a lack of leadership at the senior level, at the junior level. There's a lack of equipment. There's a lack of actual, well, what are we going to do? In other words, there's a lack of a role. So this question gets into some of those corners. I would tell you from my own personal observations, and having been involved with Senator Hugh Segal in putting a lot of each of the, not each, but almost all of the provincial job legislation, job protection legislation in place back, I guess, about 10 years ago. Hugh drafted the federal legislation, and then I helped him get to various bits and pieces of the provincial legislators that needed to do this, because, of course, the labor legislation is a provincial issue in this country. Anyway, I think there's pretty good job legislation protection in place right across the board, and quite frankly, I've never heard of anybody having any serious problems with it. And I'm almost certain that I can say that in the time that we've had it, no employer has been charged with an infraction. I think the federal government could have and should have been charged on a few occasions, but that didn't happen. At any rate, I don't think that this is a serious problem. But back to the question of is it necessary to do this, and does it take into to modernize the reserves? Yes, it has to be done. And how do we take into account the actual conditions of reserve service? I think that the folks in NDHQ know very well what they have to do. It's just a matter of getting it done. And indeed, there was a lot of work has gone on within the Army along these lines well before the DPR came out. So back in October of 2015, at the urging of the former government, both the Prime Minister and the Minister of National Defence at the time, the CDS issued a directive on the 15th of October 2015, just before the election, as you may recall, saying that the reserves, all reserves, had to be strengthened. And it's quite a detailed rendition of the problems and how he was hoping, or is hoping, that these can be resolved. So work had begun before the DPR was even written. Anyway, the DPR has now strengthened a lot of what the direction that was issued talked about. Because now it's government policy, whereas before it was just the CDS's policy. And I really hasten to say that the guy that, as far as the Army Reserve is making this work, is obviously the Army Commander. And he is totally on side. He's on record as saying he has two priorities. One is to get the Canadian Army back into Europe, and the Latvia situation is a big piece of that. But his second priority is to strengthen the Army Reserve. And he knows very well how serious the problems are and what they are. So he, for example, at some risk to himself, going back to this question of risk aversion that's been the order of the day in NDHQ for so many years, he has he ordered that and made a deal with the Canadian Forces recruiting group, the centralized authority that was so centralized that it was constipated. He made a deal that recruiting would now be returned to reserve Army units as of the 1st of April of this year. And that has happened, and lo and behold, the numbers are actually rapidly coming up. Part of the problem is going to be that this DPR didn't allocate any new money to the reserves in this fiscal year or next fiscal year. So the Army Commander, recognizing that really, if you want to increase the strength of the reserves, you got to have better recruiting, more efficient recruiting, faster recruiting, and you also have to have better retention of trained soldiers. So he's got the recruiting part the recruiting piece in place, and he got into this DPR, which was a tremendous achievement as far as I'm concerned, a statement of government policy that as of next year, next fiscal year, starting next fiscal year, any reservist that wants summer employment in the first 4 years of their service will be given summer employment. That was key to retaining the young soldiers that we worked so hard to get, and then they would leave because they couldn't make enough money during the summer in order to carry on, generally speaking, in order to carry on their post-secondary education. So, look, there's lots of good things happening. Is this going to modernize the reserve? Yes, I think it is. If we ever want to get into the question of mobilization, Dan, I think that's probably the subject of another whole seminar here, and I'd be glad to talk about it, but I don't know that it would really benefit us to get into that tonight. So I'm optimistic, and I've been at this game for a long time. I'm optimistic that good things are happening, but I can tell you that nothing's going to happen until there is money allocated to the job. So this fiscal year, the Department of National Defense gets $615 million new dollars. This is as of the day the DPR came out. The Army Commander's problem is to get his hands on enough of that money to pay for the new recruits that he's picking up this year. He hasn't got it yet. He was not given any new money to do this. I'm optimistic that he'll be able to get that out of the $615 million. But next year, the government has not allocated any new money to D&D. So that's a real priority that Reserves 2000 sees, and we're lobbying with the government to say, look, you've got to allocate that money or it's not going to happen. So, great things, but nothing happens without the dollars. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Any comments from anyone else on the panel? Keith?
Just one quick comment. When I read this question, I was reminded about two-term Vice President Joe Biden's statement. And I use it at work in my own company. And it's a very simple statement. He said, don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. And an incredibly powerful statement. I think it ties in well with what John just spoke about. Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget. I'll tell you what you value.
And just to reinforce that message, the whole budget, the whole pay budget, which is the key here for the Army Reserve, is in order, even with picking up these new recruits this summer, it'll be in the order of about $250 million. That's the pay budget. Now, when you look at the size of the overall federal budget, when you look at the size of the $20 billion plus defense budget, that is absolute peanuts. So back to Keith's point, I mean, how much are the reserves really valued?
Okay. Well, an important word has been put on the table, fiscal. We haven't talked about that yet.
Dan?
We haven't talked about, I'm sorry, Bob, I missed you there. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just another small point to add to Colonel Selkirk's. I think the summer employment thing is huge on retention, but the other thing we see in here is interesting jobs. They're talking cyber operators, intelligence operators, sending guys overseas to teach courses like you've been doing. They're not proposing a laundry and bath platoon and expecting people to join. So interesting work. I think it's another upside to the plan.
No, you're right. Good observation. So I've mentioned in my opening remarks that there was a very well done review by Colonel Charles Simpson for the CDAI, Conference of Defense Associations Industry, and I pulled out an observation that he made with respect to defense spending and defense spending processes in Canada. And basically what he concluded was that the problem from his perspective was that the whole defense spending process is flawed due to political partisanship. And what he wrote was this. He said, perhaps more importantly, future processes will need to include much more substantive consultation and discussion with other political parties in Parliament, and in particular the official opposition, the most likely eventual successor government. Failure to improve long-term political consensus building on Canadian defense policy makes yet more hugely wasteful redirects following future elections likely, and the nation simply can't afford them. My question to Julie Lindhout, who has tremendous experience in Canada and in NATO, as you know, was this. I said, do you believe that this vision of nonpartisanship, given the highly partisan nature of politics at this time, do you think this vision is possible? And then I threw in a trick question. I said, do you see the attempt to acquire a so-called interim fighter jet capability as an example of this problem? Julie?
Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome.
Yes, I think most definitely that is an example of that, because it's the only way, according to many people, that particular proposal makes any sense. Very few people think that it makes military sense. In fact, many people even question that there is a gap. So it does happen. But on the other side, if you look at the way the policy is worded, it doesn't really have to be that way. There are ways that vision could be implemented. If all the new promises about openness, accountability, total cost accounting, et cetera, are really carried out, are actually done, then I think that could lead to a much more informed discussion that could make people just simply make total reversals of the kind that we have seen with, like, the Sea King helicopter replacement, et cetera. That would make them much less likely to happen. And I think the last report, the defense policy, the Senate report that came out a month earlier, a couple of months ago, is actually a good indication of how a group can work together, because the senators who worked on that report are quite across the political spectrum, and they were able to agree on this. Now, I also spoke to one senator a few months ago who was violently opposed and asked that her name be removed from the report, but that's another whole issue. But the fact is that I think it could happen. But I do agree, I think, I do agree with Colonel Simpson that it would be better if there were some kind of formal way written into the whole policy or into the process of involving especially the official opposition, but all the parties, because that way there is more of an obligation on the part of everybody to talk together and to make some kind of commitment or some kind of statement of either agreement or public disagreement. That could happen too, but it is less likely to lead to those total reversals that we have seen in the past, which have been absolutely disastrous, both financially and time-wise, that it's delayed things that needed to be done. Some of the specific suggestions in the report, in the policy on procurement, I think could make a big difference for future procurement. Among other things, the increase in the amount of money that D&D is able to deal with on its own, I think will certainly improve a lot of the situation. One I find kind of interesting, the proposal to work with industry and researchers in academia to come up with new inventions, new proposals, and it even includes a kind of a competitive process in that it actually reflects very closely what happened with the F-35 development process. So I find it rather amusing that this is now considered to be a great process. Maybe they have learned something from what happened in that situation. But I do think there are some optimistic tones that could lead to some better procurement practices in the future.
Keith?
I think, like everyone in this room, I'm quite hopeful that procurement opens the pipe in an efficient manner and a cost-effective manner, and that policy and partisanship come together. But the real issue I think we have to transcend is the regional economic benefits of procurement and how we allocate defense spending. And I think that goes beyond partisanship. It certainly is a regional issue, and how we allocate, whether we're going to build trucks in British Columbia or we're going to procure and build ships on the East Coast or the West Coast. I think the regionality of it comes into play, and I think that we need to balance our needs with regional economic benefits if we're going to be more efficient and cost effective.
Okay, thanks, Keith. The final two subjects that caught my eye actually, in a sense, extend this question of the financial capability of the armed forces to achieve some specific objectives that are stated in the Defense Policy Review. Excuse me. And the first one talks to Canadian Armed Forces joint capabilities. So let me just read a section from that particular piece. It says that, quote, that the Canadian Armed Forces must improve cryptographic capabilities, information operations capabilities, and cyber capabilities to include cybersecurity and situational awareness projects, cyber threat identification and response, and the development of military-specific information operations and offensive cyber operations capabilities able to target, exploit, influence, and attack in support of military operations. My question was this: given that the Canadian Armed Forces is already many years behind its allies in the development of a cyber capability, coupled with the government's extremely poor track record at implementing technical systems, such as the Phoenix Pay system and Shared Services Canada, for example, what do you believe would be the best strategy to pursue a national cyber capability, and what role, if any, should the private sector have in this space? This is not an easy question to answer. It's obviously a very expensive capability that the Canadian Armed Forces wants to pursue, but I thought the guy that might be able to answer this question for us is none other than John Thompson.
I think we're going to have to get on a really steep learning curve, and we're going to have to suffer the electronic equivalent of a Pearl Harbor, I think, before Ottawa takes it seriously. We have a sort of a disease in Canada. I call it the who me attitude. You know, there's been a consistent refusal for decades to imagine that, say, for example, terrorism could occur here, that international organized crime, transnational crime would be operating in Canada. We often refuse to recognize these threats until it's too late. And yeah, I'm sure I'm speaking for at least for you, Dr. Morden, I mean, your own professional frustrations, because you must have seen this many times, that you can talk about what's happening, but getting people to believe it is something else. And of course, Canada, we might have very innovative soldiers, but we don't have a very innovative military history. You know, we're often the last to pick up a new technology and to start to really work with it, even though we're a pioneering country that's often in the lead with a new technology. And the cybernetic side, and of course also the electronic side, would include things like drones, which we are behind the 8 ball on, and everything else. We do have, I think, some fairly enhanced capabilities we don't talk about and that's in the CSIC, or I think they're calling themselves CSE again. However, I mean, they are habitually the most quiet and closed-mouthed and clannish group in Ottawa that there is. But their job of protecting government communications, I think, has been well executed for a long time. It's everybody else, and it's our military units. And we're still coming out of, I think, a military environment where we thought of the intelligence types as the company of people who memorized Orbats and knew how to recognize different Soviet armored vehicles. And really haven't sort of picked up on the new way intelligence works, where you do have to have continuous multi-dimensional surveillance all around you, electronic surveillance. However, one thing to remember, although, is that cybernetic warfare is still new. We've sort of look back in military history and look at other things, and we've got our equivalents of the Gatling gun and the Maxim gun out there now. We've got our equivalents of the first aircraft and the first tanks, but we don't know what it can really do yet. And there's been a few experiments, there's been a few essays in cybernetic warfare, but the full impacts have yet to be seen, and that'll probably have to wait for a major war. And then we'll find out what's really going on. But at least we need to invest in the basics, have some capability, some trained people, some knowledge of operations, some doctrine worked out, something we can build on, like we built up our modern army in 1916 and in 1942-43.
Thanks, John. Certainly there was a lot of emphasis placed on cyber in that defense policy review, as well as space. This is an area that Canada has some experience in, but we don't tend to talk about ourselves as a space nation, but in fact we have quite a lot of capability in that regard, and those two shall we say, new operating environments, the cyber environment and the space environment, are being touted as the next frontier, if I might use that old phrase. But in any event, it's a very important subject, but a very expensive one.
Well, let's not forget that right now the world is undergoing 3 different technological revolutions more or less simultaneously. The electronics revolution brought on by the microchip is well matured. The robotics revolution is only beginning. But we should also be paying very close attention to sort of the life sciences, the biological revolution. Because again, there's other stuff out there that'll be even more deadly. And we don't even think about it, and we should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Bob?
Well, I was just going to add, I was surprised by what I thought was the breathtaking assertion that we would develop an offensive cyber capability.
Yes, absolutely. We at the Joint Command and Staff program at the college, we have a segment or a module on cyber warfare in the Advanced Joint Warfighting stream, and we always bring in folks from what is now the new Cyber Command, which is a fledgling unit within the Canadian Armed Forces, and it's emphasized in those seminars time and time again. We have no offensive cyber capability. We do not require an offensive cyber capability. And lo and behold, the Defense Policy Review says we want an offensive cyber capability. So it's a real interesting turnaround. Keith?
Bob, I think it's a great point, and I think part of it deals with the background of our minister. Any policy review has many minds and many organizations involved in it. But her particular background and her particular experiences with the Russian Federation, I think, put her mark on the paper in terms of cyber. And I think it's one of the clear areas within the document where you can see her past experience coming to the fore.
Good point.
I think just one other point, of course, is that we have some catching up to do, and we'd better hurry. Among other things, of course, looking at Iran, which is advancing very strongly in this field, but I think actually the most amusing piece of news is North Korea, in which you may all remember the famous satellite photograph of North Korea at night. There's a little puddle of light around Pyongyang, and the rest of the country is pitch dark. And the country is desperate to avoid letting its citizens actually find out what life is like outside the country. But even they are trying to work on a cybernetic warfare capability and building up cyber units from the bottom up. Of course, this leads, how could they possibly do it? And sort of visions of a North Korean squad, sort of, squad, turn your monitors on, don't look at them, and moving on. But that's the amusing idea. But on the other hand, apparently, for a bunch of rank amateurs who don't know how to use computers, they're already causing damage.
Absolutely. And they're certainly catching up to the Chinese and the Russians in that capacity. Right. I'm going to give the final question over to Bob Kennedy. There was a section that caught my eye in the review called "A Changing Arctic," and that section says the following. It says, "Climate change, combined with advancements in technology, is leading to an increasingly accessible Arctic. A decade ago, few states or firms had the ability to operate in the Arctic. Today, state and commercial actors from around the world seek to share in the longer-term benefits of an accessible Arctic. Over time, this interest is expected to generate a corresponding rise in commercial interest, research, and tourism in and around Canada's Northern Territory. This rise in activity will also bring increased safety and security demands related to search and rescue and natural or man-made disasters to which Canada must be ready to respond." So the question that I posed to Bob is this one. I said, while successive governments have indicated that the Arctic is a critical issue for Canadian sovereignty, the environment, Indigenous peoples, and so on, very little has been done to improve our capacity or capability to project Canadian presence or to operate in that region. Given the increasing presence of Russia and China in the Arctic, do you believe that Canada is actually willing to make the necessary investments to match that rhetoric? And if not, what might the consequences be? Again, just a very small question.
Thank you, Dan. I surprised myself, in short, by concluding that the answer is yes. For a variety of reasons, most of which do not apply to the rest of the document. The first reason is that two of the main assets actually are happening now, which is to say the Arctic Offshore Patrol vessels are under construction now. The first is due to be operational by the end of next year. The second has had its keel laid already. The other large piece is the port at Nanisivik, which is at the eastern entrance to the Northwest Passage at the north end of Baffin Island. It is under construction this summer as we speak and is expected to be operational by the end of next summer. In both cases, we are getting less than was promised, but we are nevertheless actually getting new resources in the north. The second reason that I think many of the resources we need for the north are going to appear is that they are multidisciplinary. In other words, we need them for other reasons, and we'll be able to apply them to the north. The Aurora Patrol aircraft, for example, will need to be replaced, not for the sake of the Arctic, but for many other reasons also. And there's a lot of other equipment like that, the satellite assets being improved and so on, for general reasons that will also benefit operations in the Arctic. Thirdly, there are many aspects of the needs up there which can be described in terms that are not military. In other words, the Liberal government does not necessarily need to talk about defending the North. They can talk about protecting the fragile environment of the North, and we need the same assets to do that, which is to say we need to be able to stop a ship that is passing through to ensure that the environmental regulations operational on that ship conform to our own. We need to be able to manage the navigational assets, and that the government can argue is about trade. It's not about defense. And so we can gain a lot of these assets for reasons other than hard military reasons. Another one, of course, is their ability to argue now that we can be partnering with Indigenous peoples in the North to protect the traditional lands of the peoples there. This will take the same assets as we would need to actually intercept a ship. So they can, I think, accomplish a lot of what needs to be done while not looking particularly military. Another aspect of that is the expansion of the Special Operations Command. You mentioned the Soviets or the Russians and the Chinese, and that is new as a threat, essentially, in the North, because historically our problem in the North has been with our friends, not with our enemies. And so that is the last aspect, suggesting to me that many of these assets will happen whether the Canadian public wants them to happen or not, and that is because the Americans will do what they think is necessary, whether we think it's necessary or not. The North Warning radar system will be revised, whether we think we need to or not, because the Americans are sure that it must be. And so, historically, they have done exactly that. The Alaska Highway was an American project that they decided to do, which we decided to cooperate with. The Norman Wells oil facilities, likewise, the Americans thought it was necessary, so we went along because we had to. So, in short, a lot of the things that the Defense Review promises for the North, I think, are likely to happen for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily related to defense policy.
Okay, Bob, thanks very much for that. I appreciate that. Any comments from the panel on that?
I think probably a somewhat generic comment that flows out of that about the policy as a whole. It doesn't come right out and say so, but there is an implication that defense spending is not a zero-sum game. It's not that you take the money away from everything else and spend it in the military. Bob gave some good examples about what's useful. Extending runways in the North, doing a whole lot of those things. Everything that we need is jointly usable. The policy itself makes a very good statement in one of the sidebars about the benefits of the Canadian defense industry and its benefits to the country in many ways. Throughout the policy, there are statements about armed forces jobs are good jobs, reservist jobs are good jobs. Well, you put together that kind of expenditure, promoting Canadian industry, promoting opening up the North, etc. Those are very beneficial things for the country as a whole. And I think that flavor coming through this particular policy statement could be very, very useful.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Well, with that, we're going to take a break. I've got a couple of minutes to 8. Could we please come back at 5 after 8? And then we're open for your questions and any other further discussion that you're interested in. So 5 after.